Welcome to the Wired for Success podcast, your show for ambitious, mission-driven entrepreneurs who want to build million-dollar businesses without sacrificing their health, relationships, or happiness, who understand that in order to build their empire, they need a solid foundation, and that the more they are thriving, the more their business is thriving too. This show brings you the very best from science, self-development, and entrepreneurship to set you up for sustainable success. Hi, I'm Claudia Garbutt, the scientist turned mindset and high-performance coach for entrepreneurs, and I help you get wired for success. Hey everyone, and welcome back to a brand new episode of the Wired for Success podcast, where we talk about all things science, self-development, and entrepreneurship that help you get to that next level of success in your life and business. And my guest today is Mark Graban, an internationally recognized author, speaker, podcast host, coach, consultant, and entrepreneur. Mark is an experienced leader using the LEAD methodology, change management, and continuous improvement methods with experience in manufacturing, healthcare, and software startups. His latest book is The Mistakes That Make Us, Cultivating a Culture of Learning and Innovation. And it is inspired by one of his podcasts called My Favorite Mistake. So welcome, Mark, and thank you so much for taking the time to be on my show today.
Thank you, Claudia. I hope it wasn't a mistake to go holding my book up in the video. I made you laugh. Sorry.
That's totally fine.
It's great to be here.
We'll definitely talk about that as well. So, Mark, let's start by providing a little bit of background and just context for our listeners today. Can you give us a brief overview of what you have done to come to this point where you do the work that you're doing today?
Yeah. It's funny to think about it. I would have never thought I would have been involved in startup companies or be an entrepreneur myself. You know, I grew up in a household. You know, they say entrepreneurs tend to come from families with entrepreneurs. I grew up, a great household. My dad was not an entrepreneur. He was an engineer who worked 40 years at General Motors. And I started my career at General Motors as an industrial engineer. Didn't really think I was going to be there 40 years, but I just had this mindset that a career would be in large, most likely manufacturing companies. That was my plan or expectation. But I think there's a lesson learned of, sometimes you have to be flexible and willing to let a career go in a different direction. So I had an opportunity in 2000, I worked for a startup software company in the early 2000s. So that was my first dabbling in small company environments. And then I had an opportunity in 2005 to do consulting in healthcare with hospitals and healthcare organizations, using practices and principles from manufacturing, engineering, and management to help people in healthcare improve. And then in 2010, that sort of created opportunity for me to start my own business, where I do all the things you mentioned at the top of the episode. I sometimes partner up with other consulting firms. And I also, in 2011, became involved with another startup software company, not as a founder, but this time as sort of the third person involved in the company. That company is Kinexus. And so I'm fortunate that I get to do a lot of different things, both kind of, on my own and in partnership with others. As an entrepreneur, with all the excitement and the stress or struggles of having my own business, and then being part of a startup, which is, like you said, there are ups and downs, but generally is moving in a really positive direction. That's not what I would have expected in 1995 when I graduated from college.
Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, this really resonates with me because I'm a very reluctant entrepreneur myself. It's something that I never planned on doing. It's just sort of what happened.
Yeah.
So I totally relate to that.
Yeah.
Now, coming back to the theme of your podcast and of your new book, which is Favorite Mistakes. I really love that framing because it takes the shame out of the equation and really allows us to look at mistakes through the lens of learning. And this lens really helps us to stay open and curious so that we can figure out what went wrong and how we can improve next time. So I got to ask you about your favorite mistakes, of course.
Right.
So what were the favorite mistakes that really shaped you, and what have you learned from them about yourself and about how the world works?
So, but I mean, before answering that real directly of, okay, a favorite mistake story for my career, I love the way you framed that. And I want to comment first on this idea of taking the shame out of making mistakes and reminding ourselves, we all make mistakes. We are making the best decisions that we can at a moment in time. And then sometimes minutes, days, months, years later, we get more information, different perspectives, and we realize, oh, okay, that decision wasn't as good as I thought it was at the time. That happens. I mean, we're doing the best we can. And as we get more information, or as we replace assumptions with data or facts or knowledge, hopefully we're in a position where we can adjust. And shame is the one thing that holds us back of either shaming ourselves or being shamed by others, whether that's your boss, others in your workplace. So I think, there's two levels. One is trying to not shame yourself, the inner voice or the things that you're saying. And then we can talk about workplaces. What can leaders do to create an environment where people can focus, as you summarized so well, on learning instead of shame or punishment or what have you. But, I think one of my favorite mistake stories that goes back to the last manufacturing job that I had back in 2004. I was going through a certification process. Forgive the jargon, but basically a black belt, as people say, within, in particular, Six Sigma, but this was more on the lean manufacturing side of those methodologies at a company, Honeywell. And I had to do a certification project. And I was working with a department. And the mistake, jumping to the end of it, is, my mistake was doing too much of the improvement work myself and not doing enough to engage the people who were working in that department. And, I think there's two pieces of my reflection. So one, I'm not trying to just beat myself up for not engaging the people in that team more fully. There's a second piece where really kind of the workplace culture that I was a part of didn't really encourage or enable or allow that level of engagement, right? So the culture in the organization that I was working in was really emphasizing, hey, Mark, you're the expert. You're getting certified. You need to go do this. And you can't bother the people working this department because they're too busy, and that's not their job to improve anything. They're just working. And like at the time, I knew that wasn't really the right approach to change. But at the same time, I could only do so much. So part of my reflection, instead of just blaming the culture or the circumstances I was a part of my takeaway and my reflection, now that I work as a consultant and coach to other organizations, I don't want to be put in that position again. If somebody says, hey, Mark, we're going to hire you and you come in and fix it for us, I'm going to say, wait a minute, I don't know. I don't think that's really the most effective way to go about it. It's not the most respectful way to try to improve an organization. So that was one of the takeaways, right? To try to at least take ownership for the situations that I get put into. And I have more choice now as a consultant than I did back, almost 20 years ago when I was an employee.
I like how you brought up ownership, because that's another thing that's really important. And I think a good question to ask here is maybe, how did I contribute to the situation that I was in? How did I let this happen? Because as you said, there are different layers, and it's maybe part your fault, but also part the company's fault. So just being aware of where all this fits together.
All you can do is control your actions in the future, right? And you can reflect upon your actions in the past. And that's one of the common themes that I've appreciated from guests on my podcast, My Favorite Mistake. Going back to early episodes, episode 1, Kevin Harrington, who was one of the sharks on the US version of the show Shark Tank.
Mm-hmm.
Episode 2 was a United States congressman, member of the House of Representatives, who told a mistake about the first time he ran for Congress and lost. And instead of blaming his consultants, he took responsibility for his actions of not listening to his consultants. And I think it's really powerful. Like there could be other factors involved in your story, but when people take ownership, like you said, Claudia, of what I did, I think that's it's admirable. I think that sets a good example that that inspires me to try to continue doing the same.
That's awesome. Now, we all know, as you pointed out before, that we're not perfect.
Right.
We all make mistakes, yet our society in general is not really great at embracing mistakes as stepping stones towards success. Instead, as we mentioned, there's a lot of just blaming and shaming and finger pointing going on, all of which is not really helpful at all. So the only thing it does, it makes people feel so awful about themselves and about what they've done that they don't want to admit their mistakes and they don't want to deal with them. And then it leads to a lot of denial and covering up and avoiding. So what do you think needs to change, maybe on a societal level, to help individuals feel better about their own mistakes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question I agree with you. There are societal human pressures. Like, I think, the human tendency to try to deflect responsibility by blaming others is very deeply ingrained, like not even like more deeply than a societal level, like even at like a DNA level. Like just one quick story of like reading about there was a gorilla named Coco who, I don't know if you've heard of Coco, who had trainers, scientists working with Coco, and I'm pretty sure it was a she. They taught Coco sign language, and Coco could communicate like very well, like learning words and phrases and being able to communicate and articulate things. And as the story goes, I believe this to be true. They came in one morning and they saw Coco's enclosure and environment, and there was like a sink that had been ripped out of the wall.
Okay.
Now, one of the behaviors they had worked with Coco on was actually having a very human-like behavior of having a pet cat, like a real live animal that Coco could coexist with and care for and love. Well, they asked Coco what happened, looking at the sink had been ripped out of the wall. Clearly, Coco had done it for whatever reason, but they asked, basically what happened. And Coco in sign language said, "Cat did it."
That's hilarious.
What? Like, so I think it goes to show, like, from a evolutionary perspective, like, helpful, apparently blaming and deflecting responsibility is a good survival technique. And so I think we're still battling that today in the year 2023 as humans.
That's a very good point. I had heard about Coco, but I hadn't heard that story. So this is amazing. No.
But back to your question of what do we do about it? I mean, I think like in a workplace as a subset of society, there's really good research and teaching out there in this realm of what we call psychological safety. That leaders can't just tell people they should feel safe admitting mistakes, or I think it's unhelpful to tell people things like, well, you should be brave, you should be courageous. Leaders can create the conditions in which people feel safe. And there's really two things leaders can do. And then I don't know how well this extends to society as a whole. Leaders can model the behaviors they want to see, such as admitting a mistake. Like Greg Jacobson, who's a co-founder and CEO at KaiNexus, is a startup software company, will readily admit mistakes for the purpose of learning. He's not shaming himself. He's not, but he's modeling the behaviors he hopes others in his team would then follow the lead on. And then when others on the team admit a mistake, Greg as a leader and others need to reward others for doing the same. So that means reacting kindly and constructively, focusing on learning and improvement instead of punishment and naming and shaming. So, how do we do that at a societal level? I don't have as good of an answer for that. But I think within a team, within a workplace, I think there's some pretty clear recommendations.
Yes, absolutely. I think modeling the behavior you want to see is really, really powerful. And basically the only way that really works, it's just as with kids and being a parent, right? You can tell them, but they will watch for what you do rather than what you say you do. And that's what they will learn. So it's the same in the company, I guess. So it's maybe it's really more about this bottom up change, like on an individual level, that will then result in a change on a higher level as well, rather than trying to change on a society level and then have the change trickle down.
Yeah, but I mean, I know, like, I can speak, more for the culture in the U.S. There is a tendency when something bad happens to ask who messed up, right? Looking for somebody to blame or to punish, instead of looking at, I think, the more important questions around, systems and, sometimes, something goes wrong and we need to learn from it. We need to put some measures in place so that mistake doesn't get repeated. But there's nothing to say that punishment is a necessary part of the follow-up. But I think there's still this societal habit, whether it's some sort of accident or a medical mistake. There are accidents, large and individual. There's still this tendency to ask who made the mistake instead of asking why could that have happened? How was that not prevented? I think those are more important questions, where when we punish, that might feel good, but it's probably not helpful for the future.
That's so true. That's a really important mindset shift. Now, you already talked a little bit about modeling the right behavior, but can you maybe share some really specific action steps that leaders can take to cultivate this feeling of psychological safety amongst their employees?
Yeah. And feeling it, I mean, that's the right word. First off, it is a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I've learned, about psychological safety is, while, you can do surveys in a team or across an organization, and you can look at averages of people's feelings of psychological safety, that feeling or that perception or that belief is very individual and it's very situational, right? So, like, right now we're doing this podcast interview. Like, I don't have any reason to feel unsafe with you, Claudia, right? I mean, so we've just met, and it might be a different environment in a workplace where I know if I speak up and disagree with somebody, I might get punished in some way. I learn not to speak so freely in that environment. So somebody who might seem outspoken or brave in one setting might act very differently in another, which I think, again, speaks to the power of culture and environment. You put the same person in different situations, they're going to feel different degrees of psychological safety. So again, like, what not to do is to try to, declare safety to exist, or to say, well, this is a safe space. Claudia, let's say you're joining a team where me and others have been working, and we have a good culture where we focus on learning and growth instead of punishment. And let's say you came from a workplace where that wasn't true. I can't expect you to, say, Claudia, you should feel safe here.
Yeah.
You have to decide the way, based on how we're interacting and working with you. You may decide then that you feel more safe. So some of those things that you can do in those categories of modeling and rewarding some of these behaviors. I think saying things like, I made a mistake, I could be wrong. Like, I think that's a helpful phrase. And being less certain about, for example, saying, I know what we need to do here. And instead thinking about, thinking in terms of less certainty, like, we have a hypothesis, we've discussed it, we've debated it. Let's move forward, but let's test that idea, because you know what? We could be wrong. Saying things like that, admitting when you don't know something can be a very helpful behavior for a leader. Modeling the behaviors where we want others to follow their lead, where people feel safe to speak up about anything, saying, I don't know, I don't feel comfortable doing this. There's like this learning and training aspect where if people don't feel comfortable to say, I'm not really sure how to do this, they may then make more mistakes because they didn't feel safe asking about how to do the work. And this happens a lot in healthcare, and the implications are really serious. We want people to feel safe speaking up about mistakes or problems or opportunities for improvement. I have an idea. Like, some workplaces really love to attack people for suggesting things could be better. What? How dare you?
That's true.
So we want to be careful about behaviors that would, sort of pressure people into keeping quiet versus behaviors that help people feel safe to speak up. Now, at the same time, psychological safety doesn't mean you always get your way or that everybody has to agree with you. I think in a culture of psychological safety, there's more respectful debate that takes place. So, like, sometimes people, I think, misunderstand psychological safety, and they'll use that phrase to try to shut down debate. They'll say, wait a minute, whoa, you can't disagree with me. What about my psychological safety? I'm like, that's psychological safety is about the freedom and safety to speak up. It's not the freedom to be, not challenged or not disagreed with.
That's an important distinction that a lot of people have to learn. And I think something that is also really helpful is learning nonviolent communication. Just how do you communicate so that the other person does not feel instantly attacked,
right?
But you can still get your point across and you can meet somewhere in the middle. That's very helpful.
There's a difference between saying something like, I see why you're making that suggestion, but I've got a couple of concerns. Maybe we can talk through that. Hopefully that seemed pretty nonviolent. As opposed to saying something like, oh, what's wrong with you? That'll never work. What were you thinking? That's going to shut people down.
Exactly. Thank you so much for those tips. I think they're really helpful for a lot of people, because one thing that I still see a lot of people struggle with is just this need to always be the smartest person in the room or to always have an answer. And this is something a lot of people struggle with, because internally they might still have like imposter syndrome and just feel like, oh, they don't have everything figured out. But if they admit that they don't have everything figured out, then there's not the strong leader they want to be. So they need to be the smartest person in the room.
That can be a hard habit or mindset to get past. But I think there's a lot to be said for the idea that, when a leader admits that they are not infallible, that they're not all knowing, when a leader admits they were wrong, they might be wrong, when a leader invites disagreement, that builds trust, that builds respect. I think, the idea that as a CEO or a founder or a leader that you've somehow created this facade of perfection. Look, the people working for you know you're not perfect. They might not want to say anything about it, but they know. So, I think being authentic, and I think when a leader says things like, I could be wrong, it's not meant to be like this false humility or habit, but I think just trying to be, authentic and to invite disagreement. And, I think a question, you have to know an executive fairly well to ask this question. Like, do I feel safe asking this question to a leader? So it's more comfortable to ask it very broadly to you and your listeners. Can you remember the last time an employee disagreed with you?
That's a good question.
And if you can't, there's probably some sort of problem. And the problem is not the employees. It's probably, you think back to like, if you're shutting people down for disagreeing, people will learn to just go along and agree. And that leads to all sorts of problems for a startup or a business of any size. When people are stifled, when they're shut down, we want the best ideas to come out based on what the idea is and how we test or prove out an idea, as opposed to the idea coming from the most powerful person in the room. The leader and the most powerful person, it probably isn't always wrong, but if we assume they're always right, I think that's a more dangerous assumption.
That's true. Now, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the lean methodology in general. Can you summarize and explain the lean startup principles for our listeners today?
Yeah, so lean startup, as written about, popularized by Eric Ries, is really born from quote unquote lean manufacturing. So the abbreviated history lesson is, lean manufacturing is credited really back to the 1950s, we'll say, with Toyota. And there are roots and elements of the Toyota production system that date back further. But let's just say post-World War II, Toyota, and over decades, they developed something that came to be known as the Toyota production system, kind of generalized a little bit more broadly using these terms like lean manufacturing or lean management. When I started my career at General Motors, nobody really wanted to admit that they were learning from or copying Toyota. There was pride and history and a lot involved. So when you can use a non-Toyota term, sometimes that's a little helpful. So lean manufacturing, I think is, the Toyota people would say it's about a culture and mindsets and a management system and some technical methods that really engage everybody in continuous improvement. So compared to the culture we were trying to change, at the last manufacturing company I worked with, where you had this clear separation between workers and improvers, I think, in a lean culture, everybody is an improver. It's not all top-down decision-making from executives. There's a balance. There might be some top-down goal setting, but a lot of bottom-up ideas around how do we achieve those goals and close gaps in performance, and trying to improve in an experimental way. There's an old cycle that's been sort of adapted into the lean startup approach. It's either called the PDCA or PDSA model. I like the language PDSA: plan, do, study, adjust. A very cyclical, iterative approach to moving forward. Lean startup really embraces a lot of that, right? The different concepts of, instead of as an entrepreneur saying, I know I have this solution, let's build this software in secrecy for 2 years or however long it takes, and then we'll go to market, and then we'll hire people to sell this thing that we built. Well, that is a very risky approach, as opposed to doing things in a more iterative way. So like one of the classic, just one element of lean startup would be the idea of trying to go to market more quickly with something that you can actually test in the marketplace. And Eric Ries calls that a minimum viable product. And go and test your hypothesis of not just, do people say that they would buy it theoretically in the future? Will they actually, for example, put their credit card number into a website and buy this software or this service that might not be yet fully featured, but it's smaller steps and testing your ideas. I think those are some of the core elements of lean startup that remind me very much of the Toyota thinking.
Yeah, I think the testing and incorporating feedback and just having these feedback loops and integrating the data, that's so important. And now one of the core principles that you've already mentioned is this philosophy of continuous improvement, or Kaizen. So how can entrepreneurs adopt maybe these Kaizen principles in their business to ensure that every day brings those incremental progress that towards the $1 million goal, while all while maintaining their healthy work balance and personal well-being?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of that goes hand in hand, right? So I can point to KaiNexus, I think, is a really good example of, again, software company, technology company. For one, the software platform that we sell is used by customers to manage continuous improvement activity.
Mm-hmm.
So we have always aspired to have a culture of continuous improvement within KaiNexus. And we use our own software internally. Mm-hmm. So, there's the tool and then there's the culture. So I think, first off, on the culture, you've just got to continually ask and encourage people to speak up about problems or opportunities for improvement or ideas. Like you're encouraging people to speak up. But then when they do, whether that's in a meeting or by putting an idea into our own instance of the KaiNexus technology platform, you need to respond, promptly and constructively as a team or as leaders, right? You don't want, if you just ignore people's suggestions, for different reasons, people will learn to stop making suggestions, right? If some organizations have eliminated what you might call the fear factor, where people say, I'm not afraid to speak up, I'm not afraid to put an idea forward, but there's what you could call the futility factor. I'm not afraid to speak up, it's just not worth the effort because nothing happens. So we've worked really hard to use, again, like not the software itself, but the culture. Like software can do certain things like reminding you to follow up. Like, hey, this idea was submitted and it's been sitting there for 30 days and it doesn't look like there's been any discussion. Like that might be a helpful thing that the software does. But, having a communication platform means nothing if people aren't using it. So again, like it comes back to encouraging people to speak up, encouraging people to go test their ideas, allowing people to honestly evaluate their experiment and to say, hey, we tried something and it didn't really work out. That's learning. That's a stepping stone to success in those plan, do, study, adjust cycles. A lot of it, again, comes back to psychological safety, eliminating that fear factor, but better yet, like making sure when people speak up that it leads to action, that it leads to improvement. And then when it does, make sure you're recognizing people for their role in improvement. And that may or may not mean rewards. Like at least here in the US, people often talk about rewards and recognition. And the word rewards always comes first. I don't know if that just sounds better than saying recognition and rewards. But the emphasis usually is on rewards. Like we have to pay people. We have to incentivize people. And I think like we've done at KaiNexus and a lot of our customers do, you can tap into people's intrinsic desire to improve. When there's a strong mission that people feel connected to, they're even more likely to want to speak up. And then when they do, you have to reward that behaviorally, right? Thanking people and helping them move things forward instead of dismissing or ignoring or belittling people's ideas. Like it's a culture that you definitely cultivate over time. You don't implement a culture and say, okay, this month we're doing the culture thing. We're going to implement a culture of continuous improvement. It's an ongoing thing based on the behavior of leaders and others within a team.
Yeah, that's so true. And you have to come up with a way that really acknowledges everyone's input and feels them heard and seen and appreciated, then you maybe don't have to use the money incentives, because as you said, you can tap into the intrinsic motivation as well. Now, lean is often seen as a very process-oriented methodology, but can it also drive innovation? And if it can, how can we use it to foster creativity and breakthrough ideas?
Yeah, it's lean is very process focused, but it's also very human focused around, culture and cycles of improvement. There's often a very fine line between continuous improvement and more radical change or innovation or step function improvement. The difference between making small refinements to an existing process versus completely rethinking the process. There's a time in a place where the underlying fundamentals of the process have so many problems. We need to really reinvent it instead of just refining what we already have. I think of a hospital CEO who I got to meet in my journeys here in Japan, hospital president in Tokyo, who had gotten a lot of training on quality improvement methodologies from Toyota and similar companies. And one thing he said, and I've seen this play out in a lot of different organizations, he said something like, the best way to find a large idea is to look for many small ideas. And I think there's something really powerful there, where if in some organizations, I think, make the mistake of asking people to come up with grand, revolutionary, $1 million, €1 million, if you will, ideas. Those are few and far between. And I think sometimes people put too much pressure on themselves. That would be like asking an entrepreneur, hey, come up with an idea for $1 billion business.
Yeah.
We can sit around and think about that and talk about that. $1 billion businesses are few and far between. $1 million ideas in a workplace are going to be there. But I think when you encourage people to start small, they get better at improvement in sort of structured scientific ways. And when the culture makes it safe for them to point out problems, to think about what could be better, through small steps or larger steps, I think you're more likely to either find a relatively small idea that has a surprisingly large impact, or a small idea that can be built upon to be a larger type of change that we might then label as innovation. I think it's all very, sort of interconnected. I wouldn't agree with the statement that people say, well, all this focus on process will stifle innovation. I think it's actually quite the opposite. I think having a focus on an improvement process or an innovation process can actually lead to more improvement and more innovation. It's just, kind of a different way of going about it.
Right. And I mean, all those small improvements amount to something big. It's like the compound interest in finance, right?
If you do the math, I'm getting 1% better every day.
Exactly.
That's powerful. And, one other thing I'll point out, I mean, look, there's great benefit and value in large improvements with large benefit. But there's a lot of research that shows in different countries and different industries that of all the improvement potential in an organization, 80% of it comes from the accumulated impact of many, many, many small ideas, right? So we're not saying ignore the possibility of big ideas, but I think it's a mistake to only look for large ideas. You're literally ignoring about 80% of your improvement potential if you only focus on large ideas, if you force ROI, return on investment threshold. So, it's not worth it for you to work on that improvement because it's too small. That really kills the participation and the culture. If you shut people down with their small ideas, they're not going to speak up then about their big ideas for a lot of I think very understandable, very human reasons of, I think the worst thing a leader can do is make pronouncements about, we want to hear your ideas. We want you to speak up. And then when people do speak up, to shoot everything down. That's counterproductive. People will understandably get upset and they'll stop speaking up. And then you might not hear about someone's larger, more innovative idea.
I totally agree. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners today?
I think one thing that has become more clear to me, through research and writing with the book here, The Mistakes That Make Us, is to encourage people not only to look at, let's say, technical training around problem solving, continuous improvement, lean startup tools or technical methodologies, but to also make sure you're focusing on culture and cultivating psychological safety. A lot of startups are very focused, rightfully so, on the customer need, the problem to be solved, finding market fit with your solution. But you can also, and I think you can also focus on the culture that you're building. And I think if you focus on that from the beginning, it's easier to be intentional about building a culture of improvement, a culture of psychological safety, than it is to try to fix your culture down the road. Sometimes people only think about culture when they realize, oh, I think we have a culture problem here. That's a more difficult problem to solve than it is to, from the beginning, to also think about, like, culture is not the only thing that matters, but if you ignore culture, that causes problems. I think it needs to be we can also focus on culture, and I think that leads to a lot of benefits. I think KaiNexus, while not perfect, has had a very solid focus from the co-founders and others like me who are involved in the beginning of saying, this is the culture we are building. And not by just hiring, quote unquote, the right people, but by behaving in certain ways as leaders and encouraging others to build that culture. I think that's been really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really a very valid point. I just talked to Holger Seim, one of the co-founders of Blinkist recently, and he said they ran into huge problems because at some point they noticed that they hadn't made their intentions about the company culture explicit. So it was kind of just in their heads what they wanted to build, but they did not really communicate it well in the beginning, and then they ran into huge problems. So yes, I think that speaks to building it at the same time is probably a good idea.
Yeah.
So last but not least, where can our listeners find you online if they would like to connect with you?
Yeah, well, thank you, Claudia. So for the book's website is mistakesbook.com. My website is markgraban.com. And then, in terms of social media, I am most active on LinkedIn these days. My name is unique enough that if people search LinkedIn for Mark Graban, they can find me. I would love to connect with people there.
Perfect. Mark, thank you so much for sharing your tips and insights with us today. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, thank you, Claudia. I appreciate your questions and the insights that you shared in the course of asking those questions. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Take care and talk soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the Wired for Success podcast. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. That's a fantastic, easy, and zero-cost way to help the show grow. Just use the link in the show notes and make my day. Want more? For quick, actionable tips and insights to guided meditations and a side of biohacking, join my inner circle and get access to exclusive subscriber-only content. Again, just use the link in the show notes to join the tribe. Thank you for your support and see you on the other side. Take care and talk soon. Bye.